Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. So it just turned 4:01 IST, so we'll just give it another minute for a few of the other members to join today. So just hold tight another minute to just give everybody an extra second. Thank you. Okay, so we still have a few more people trickling in. I'm sure there will be a few others that will come in throughout the presentation. But for the sake of time, let's just go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, the carbon footprint in real estate and infrastructure, in conjunction with our partners at Envint and also APREA. So we're very excited to have all of you join today, and we certainly have a lot to talk about. But before we get started, we'd like to give a special thanks to APREA, the Asia Pacific Real Estate Association, for their part in helping to organize this. So APREA, through professional development, research, education, and advocacy, has truly been a leader for ESG and the Asia Pacific real estate sector. So thank you once again. Again, before we get started, I will just take a quick minute to introduce all of our speakers. Starting with myself, my name is Trey Archer, and I am the Business Development Director for Asia at GRESB. So as some of you already know, GRESB is the world leader in ESG scoring and benchmarking for the real estate and infrastructure space, with 120,000 assets across 66 countries reporting to GRESB. Actually, in fact, India is our largest growth market in all of Asia at the moment in terms of new participants. So that's very exciting, and it's a great sign for what's to come for the future of ESG in India. For the first speaker that we'll have today, will be from one of our current participants, Dr. Sunita Purushottam from Mahindra Life Space Developers. So Dr. Purushottam has over 25 years of sustainability consultancy experience and is a physics postgraduate with a PhD in environmental science and engineering from MIT Mumbai. She is well versed with various reporting frameworks such as SASB, GRI, CDP, and of course GRESB, and has helped many large companies globally to streamline their sustainability strategy through a process-oriented approach that enables the selection of right tools for systemic sustainability disclosure management. Afterwards, our main topic of operational and embodied carbon in the GRESB assessment will be led by GRESB's very own Victor Fonseca. Victor is a real estate analyst at GRESB, and he is a civil engineer and holds an MSc in architectural science from the University of Sydney, where he focused on high performance buildings in the commercial real estate sector. At GRESB, Victor is leading the roadmap and development on embodied carbon, is the real estate representative for the SFDR and transition risk product teams, and supports the annual assessment development cycle for the GRESB real estate assessment. After Victor, we will have our partner Anand Krishnamurthy from Envint speak on embodied carbon in India. Envint is a sustainability and ESG services firm based in India, co-founded by Anand and Manish Jain around 4 years ago. Prior to Envint, they both had extensive experience in infrastructure and real estate sectors in India, and Envint has worked with various clients across 9 countries helping corporates and investors progress on their sustainability goals. And of course, they have ample experience with the GRESB assessment. To wrap things up at the end, we have Ms. Richa Arora to give a keynote speech on ESG in India. Richa is the managing partner and CEO, ESG Stewardship Services at eCube Investment Advisors, where the firm's mission is to transform the climate and ESG landscape in India. Richa's mandate at eCube is to drive the strategy and implementation of ESG assessment and engagement for corporates and investment firms, integrating sustainability with the business core. Prior to eCube, Richa has held several top-level positions at Tata Group, Britannia Industries, Balsara Home Products, Tata Nourishco, and Tata Click, and is currently an independent director on the board of Snapdeal. Richa is an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and a Chevening Scholar from the London School of Economics. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel today. And thank you all again for joining today's event. And we will kick things off with Dr. Purushottam. So Dr. Purushottam, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity today. And I'm on the road, and therefore there is a little bit of traffic noise in the background. But without going into that, I'll start immediately with what Mahindra Life Spaces is all about. We are a real estate company into residential development and industrial cities, integrated cities and industrial clusters. We have over 40 certified residential and industrial projects. And we have been into sustainability space for a long time, since 2011, the first company, real estate company in India to publish a sustainability report till date. And we have been participating with CDP and GRESB, and we have a good rank, I would say, with GRESB. We would like to even improve further. We're founders of Mahindra Terry Center of Excellence, which is committed to research on climate conducive homes and water resilience in residential properties. So these are some of, it gives a whole overview of what Mahindra Life Spaces is all about. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some of our commitments at a very high level. We're committed to be carbon neutral, moving towards net zero, zero waste to landfill, water positivity, and it is through the science-based target that we are supposed to be achieving our carbon neutrality. We have a 100% green portfolio, like I mentioned before. Next slide. So how has GRESB helped us in enhancing our performance is what I'm going to talk about. And of course, it's related to our carbon performance and how we can look at data further for improving, for achieving our goals. Next slide. So ESG factors cover, as everybody knows, looks at corporate behavior for value creation. And what has changed is a lot of investors looking at it, and almost it has now become what people say is a fad, but it's not a fad, and it's here to stay. And companies therefore have no choice but to learn how to weave the ESG factors into the integrated into the company's financial performance. Next. So these are some of the environmental, social, and governance factors that we look at, and it helps us to manage our risks better. Next slide. And this is how investors use the ESG information. And despite property investors showing that it has an impact on the investment, the ESG issues through investment portfolio and the processes, there is relatively small, there is a growing awareness now, and more companies should come on board trying to make investor information available in the public domain and for investors to be able to make sense and have benchmarking data available across for responsible investing. Next slide. Yeah. And at the broad level, these are some of the factors that we work on, which is material to us. If you can click again, all those. Yeah, so these, so which cover energy use, GHG emissions, product sustainability, and climate risks, quality, safety, bribery, and the human right related aspects, affluent supply chain, business ethics. So it covers every aspect of environment, social, and governance. Next. So the point I would like to drive through next, if you can just keep clicking, Victor. Yeah. So there is a link of profitability and ESG performance. And as we integrate the parameters deeper into the business, better financial decision makings happen, strategic decisions making happens within the organization. So that's what we have found. Next. Yeah, so higher profitability, lower tail risk, and lower systemic risk, and integrating it through a risk management process leads to better profitability. Next. Yeah, and if you can click again. Yeah, so a recent BCG study showed that the ESG performance attained 3 to 19% higher valuation, and for us, it is definitely in the range of 3 to 5% higher valuation. From our own CFO, who has mentioned that because of our ESG performance, we have a higher valuation. Next. Yeah, if you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, it's all animated. And there is a need for comparable insights. And what we find is when we also try to do benchmarking, we don't get data within the country. We get data outside of our country, and we are looking for information so that we can improve our performance better. Currently, comparable insights within India is still a problem. Next slide. And we can skip this one. I just want to go to the benefits. These are the benchmarks that we use and which helps us through the scorecard, benchmark report, and the portfolio analysis. All these tools help us understand where we are with respect to our sustainability performance. Next. And we can skip this one as well. Over a period of time, we can track the trends. And what do these performance reports say actually about the performance is that it's basically, we can't say that we are preparing a prettier report, but actually facts are being reported there. And these are all non-financial information that we put out for in platforms such as GRESB and CDP, so that we understand where we are and where we need to go. Next. Yeah, and it is actually a catalyst for self-transformation. And this is the most important slide, I must say, for us. If you can just keep clicking. So the first and foremost, it's about, it helps us. What do disclosures, reporting frameworks ask us and help us understand where we are, what our competitors are doing. Are we ensuring that all stakeholders are on board? What are the actionable areas of improvement? We definitely use this a lot. We look at where the gaps are. Why did we not score points here? And it is actually a self-analysis tool. And then we leverage IT for management of disclosure. So it is actually a tool that we use. And as we go across the value chain now with embodied carbon becoming more and more important.
Dr. Purushottam, I think we're having trouble hearing you. I'm wondering if you've got a bad connection in your commute.
Scope 3 calculations, and the data associated with that. Data and data management is very key to all this in our transformation journey. So with that, I hand over to you, Trey. Hi, was that
Yes, yeah, thank you for that, Doctor. Much appreciated. I think there was a few technical difficulties in there, but I think we were able to hear the majority of that presentation. So, yeah, next up, our speaker for really the main topic of today will be Victor Fonseca from GRESB. So, Victor, over to you.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Victor, as Trey introduced. I'm going to be talking to you today about carbon emissions as a whole. So assessing a building for his whole life carbon. What is embodied carbon? What is operational carbon? Where it happens? Why it is important? And I'll also put a little bit into the perspective of GRESB today. So what do we capture at the moment for operational carbon when it comes to real estate and infrastructure, and embodied carbon only on real estate, as we don't capture still by the carbon infrastructure. And also in the end, I will briefly address what we are working now on the 5-year roadmap. So we are creating a vision to incorporate new topics that was raised by our stakeholders in the GRESB standards of the future. But I'll talk more in detail as my presentation goes. So yes, let's talk about GHG emissions. So there are two types of GHG emissions that happens throughout the life cycle of a building. First one, I will start with embodied carbon. So there are the carbon emissions associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of a building or infrastructure. And this not only includes the upfront carbon, so all carbon related to your value chain, all the way from extracting the raw materials to actually construct your assets or your building or your infrastructure asset, but also talking about downstream embodied carbon. So emissions associated with replacement, repair, refurbishment, and also end-of-life treatment. So how you dispose your assets. We also have, which is on the spotlight for a while already, everyone's talking about the operational carbon. Operational carbon is related to energy use during the operational stage of your building. So just to put into perspective where these emissions actually happen, I've brought a picture from the standard called EN 15978 that defines the life cycle stages of a building, also provide calculation methods for you to assess environmental footprint of your asset, in this case, your carbon footprint. And I think it's interesting to note that even though we in majority just talk about operational carbon only happens in the module B6, the one that you see painted in orange. All the rest in green represents embodied carbon. So yeah, this is another proxy for us to start putting embodied carbon on the spotlight and start acting on it, not only operational. But why does this matter in the first place? So now roughly 39% of all emissions globally comes from the building sector. This is split in 28% from operations, so energy use, operational carbon, and 11% from materials and construction processes, meaning embodied carbon. And it's interesting to flag that this proportion might change and will change in the future due to operational energy efficiency programs, grid decarbonization. The portion of embodied carbon in the overall carbon footprint of an asset will be more and more significant. And just to put this into perspective, there is this organization, nonprofit and independent, called Architecture 2030 that brings some nice stats that put it into a little bit in context. So it is expected for the global building stock to double in size by 2060. This means that 230 billion square meters of new floor area will be added to the existing building stock. This is an equivalent of adding an entire New York City every month for the next 28 years. So you can have a sense of how much materials we're going to need, and this is directly related to embodied carbon emissions. This graph on the right of the slide also tells the same story. So this is the total carbon emissions of global new constructions from 2020 to 2050. This is considering a scenario of business as usual. So for example, in the first 10 years, the emissions coming from new construction, so embodied carbon, and also the operational emissions coming from these new constructed assets. Out of the total, 74% comes from embodied carbon. And if we project this even longer to 2050, where like Paris Agreement goals reach the limit, this roughly represents 50%. So another way to look at it and actually address embodied carbon as of now. The same story happens for infrastructure. Operational carbon tends to reduce decarbonization, but also the increased plans on new infrastructure investment also will bring infrastructure to the spotlight when it comes to carbon emissions. I took this stats from the Infrastructure Carbon Review from the UK, that currently 53% of all emissions in the UK comes from infrastructure. And this tends to significantly increase in the next years. So by 2025, 80% of all emissions will come from infrastructure. And by 2050, this will represent 90%. And then we can also put in relation the embodied carbon portion and the operational carbon portion of this sector. You can see that in the pie chart on the left. So in 2025, so 7% of all emissions come from embodied carbon. But if you look 2050, 18% of this comes from embodied carbon. So it is possible to draw that both real estate and infrastructure faces the same issue, and this is like across the board. So we have to act now. Following up on what it is and why it matters, we were able to draw some analytics from the 2021 GRESB state assessment responses. And the first one that I would like to present to you is on the real estate side, and we're talking about data coverage per sector. So to put the Indian performance into perspective, I've plotted the India performance against the global performance. It is important, though, to note that there is a sample bias when it comes to India performance. We have 154 assets only compared to 117,000 assets globally. So some performance are not actually reflecting the average of the country, but the average of the assets that report to us. But all in all, this is also can serve as a proxy to show that like those in India that are taking actions are actually performing better than the global benchmark in some cases. And this is reflected in the data coverage graph. So data coverage is actually a metric that we collect. So we put into perspective the reported emissions related to the floor area that you have reported. Those emissions representing 100% of your asset, 70% of your asset, 60%, etc. So this is important. But the reason I brought this graph up is to follow up with this one. So which is the GHG emissions intensities per sector, again, globally and in India. Again, it's worth to note that there is a sample bias. Even if we look to the residential sector in India, we only had one asset. So this low intensity only represents one asset. But what I would like to take from this graph is the actual year-on-year reduction. So a metric that we collect and that we calculate called like for like. So between 2020 and 2021, globally, we have a reduction of 8%, roughly 8% of GHG emissions. Well, if you look to India, this number is even higher. This number goes to 14%. So yes, India is performing significantly good compared to the benchmark, and I hope to see this benchmark only increasing when it comes to India in the next few years. On the same side, I've tried to replicate the same stats for the infrastructure assessment that we had on GRESB. So, and this one, instead of talking about data coverage as the percentage of GHG emissions reported per asset, I'm talking about out of all assets per infrastructure sector, how much of them were able actually to provide us with their GHG emissions. So, for example, social infrastructure, around 80% were able to provide some GHG emission figures at all. The rest 20 were not even able to provide us that. It's understandable there are some barriers for data collection, but what I would like to bring is the evolution of like tracking these GHG emissions throughout the scopes and setting targets to this. So this actually shows the evolution of target setting when it comes to infrastructure assets in our assessment for the past 3 years. So we can see that we divided in 3 types of targets, being no target, 1 type of target. And if you look to just targets as general, from 2019 to 2021, we had 100% increase, which shows that the industry and is taking into account the responsibility and setting targets to decrease their emissions and to align with net zero frameworks and commitments. You see that we also track net zero targets. So this number have remained stable between 2020 and 2021. 8% of all the assets that report to us have these targets in place. But we can even break down those target setting per infrastructure sector. And if you look to this graph, the first thing that catches the eye is the renewable power sector. So we see that 2020, we had 75% of all assets reporting from to GRESB from renewable energy power setting targets. This number decreased to 2021, but it's important to note that this number is looking to the total amount of assets that report to us. And from 2020 to 2021, we had a 50% increase in participation when it comes to renewable power plants assets. So this number actually keeping that high on 60% shows how many assets are actually going out there, taking actions and setting targets. So yeah, I wanted to show this overview on what is happening on the operational carbon side when it comes to GRESB. But now I also have some stats when it comes to the embodied carbon side. Unfortunately, only for real estate, we don't capture this data point in infrastructure at the moment. So we do have 3 indicators in the development components that touch upon embodied carbon. The first one, we are asking if you have any policy requiring low embodied carbon materials for your development projects. And it's interesting to see that 52% of our participants have said yes, they do have. To put into context, we had 516 participants for the development component last year, so 50%, around half of it. We do collect a little bit a further step. So have you assessed the life cycle emissions through a life cycle assessment of your development assets? You see that this number actually decreases. It decreases to 36% of all participants. I will not go into detail about the standards they have used, as we didn't mention it, but the EN 15978 is basically the standard that defines the life cycle stages of a building, and the ISO 14040, it's the standard that provides the principles and the framework for you to conduct a life cycle assessment. But more importantly, and I think this is the most interesting stat of this slide, is the indicator about embodied carbon. So we ask if your entity have disclosed your embodied carbon emissions for the development projects you've been involved on in the last 3 years. It's surprising to see that only 17% of those, this is roughly 8 participants, have responded, yes, I did disclose. But the question goes a little bit further. There's a next step. Are those disclosures publicly available? And this number drops a little bit more. So now we're talking about 40 participants out of 516 that have disclosed their embodied carbon emissions. The indicator stops there, but we've went through a qualitative exercise. So we went through the disclosures and we collect some data points so we can provide some flavor for you today. So 82% of all this disclosure actually mention embodied carbon. Some of them, the links were broken, so we could not assess it. But what surprises me is that some of them don't mention embodied carbon at all, just talking about operational carbon. And this actually flags that there is a misconception on the topic in the industry. And this is also one of the reasons why we are here today, to raise awareness. Roughly 50% of those disclosures actually have any embodied carbon targets set for the next years. But more surprisingly is 17%, 17.5, which is roughly 8 participants out of 516 participants that have reported to us, have a whole life carbon roadmap to net zero. So this actually raises like the point of like commitments against like realizing those commitments when it comes to Paris agreements and climate change until 2050. So to finalize my presentation, as I said, we are working on developing the assessment roadmap for the next 5 years. And this is basically divided in three phases. We've went through the first phase last year, which was defining our joint vision. So we've sent a survey for all our stakeholders where we asked them which ESG issues should be prioritized in the future of the GRESB assessments. We had a big list. We went through this list, and then we are now in phase 2, which is creating a strategy to guide our work toward this vision. So we are in conversation on a strategy conversation with our foundation, our standards committee, in order to how to incorporate these flag issues within our assessment of the future. But the reason I'm bringing this is that one of the principles that supports the GRESB standards now is assessed ESG for the whole life cycle. And this is pretty much related to what we are talking today about whole life carbon, operational carbon, embodied carbon, net zero, and even more out of the issues that were flagged to us. The top 3 issues are carbon related. So the first one is start tracking progress against net zero targets. And the top 3 one was embodied carbon and life cycle assessment. So with this, I've actually finalized my presentation to you. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions that are not addressed in the Q&A later today, feel free to send us an email and I'm happy to talk about it. Over to you, Trey.
Thank you very much for that, Victor. That was very insightful. A lot of great information in there. So next we will have Anand Krishnamurthy from Envint, one of GRESB's longtime partners in India. So Anand, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Victor, for sharing some very interesting insights on embodied carbon around the world. I will very briefly touch upon the significance of embodied carbon for buildings and infrastructure in India, especially in the next coming decades, as India moves towards its net zero target of 2070. Now, buildings contribute, as you've heard, to about 39% of the GHG emissions worldwide. India is currently lower than the global average. We've estimated it to be around 25%. But this number is definitely bound to increase as more and more stock gets created in infrastructure and real estate over the next few years. And as stock gets created, the significance of embodied carbon would also increase in the overall accounting framework that we have for GHG. Now, what are the drivers for the stock to increase so significantly? If we start with the government policy and spending and see the budgets over the last few years, undoubtedly there's been massive emphasis on creation of new infrastructure and very little emphasis on, say, retrofits or improvement of existing infrastructure. So new stock is getting created across all sectors. Case in point, couple of cases in point, the National Infrastructure Pipeline has outlined $1.4 trillion of investment in infrastructure assets over the next till 2025. Interestingly, if we look at the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, the affordable housing program, that has plans to create 20 million affordable houses. While the plans are in place and the program is on, there is another study that which has come out that in the affordable housing shortage in India has in fact increased from 2012 to 2018. In that period, the shortage of affordable houses has grown by about 50%. So the speed of new infrastructure creation is in many sectors just not able to keep up with the shortage that is getting created or the aspirations that are growing. From a housing standpoint, and one of the key drivers is that urbanization is going to continue rising beyond the population peak. Population is expected to peak somewhere in the 2040s. But if we look at the projections of urbanization for 2050, it is expected to be a little less than double of what it is right now. And with increasing urbanization and increasing incomes, the quality of housing that is expected or that will be created will be more in the formal sector. The contribution of materials such as steel and cement is definitely going to increase. And with that, every year you're just adding to the carbon stock just from these two sectors. And last but not the least, in the last 2 years, we've seen the emergence of InvITs and REITs, where many investors have come in, pooled assets, started developing these sectors. With this, we expect that the capital flow in these sectors will improve, and it will lead to more formal creation of these assets. So the bottom line of this is that as India moves towards its net zero goals, this sector is going to play a very dominant role, and any actions that many of the net zero actions will be tied to these two sectors, and for that, embodied carbon is going to become more important, and we'll see in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, we've looked at a few climate disclosure project reports, sustainability reports of Indian real estate infrastructure companies, and not surprisingly, there is no disclosure on embodied carbon. It's minimal. So accounting currently is only focused on operational carbon. And we know that any carbon neutrality or net zero goal would need to account for the embodied carbon stock for it to be credible. So as more and more companies announce net zero plans or carbon neutrality plans, accounting has to include for embodied carbon. And what it could lead to is that a few things that could possibly lead to a virtuous cycle in this is that as you take stock of your contribution from the materials, there could be engagement with steel and cement companies downstream, some of which have already announced their net zero goals. There will certainly be innovations in material substitution, renovations, retrofits, and refurbishment. And if they are not considered, then there might be very little elbow room to achieve a net zero or carbon neutrality goal by just focusing on, say, energy reduction. Currently, if we look at the operational carbon accounting, the actions that come out of it for reduction are mostly focused on energy. But when embodied carbon gets added to that, the overall approach and the accounts, then it will create probably the right balance between energy reduction and material substitution or innovations in materials on the materials side to bring down the carbon footprint. So what it would definitely lead to is an integrated approach towards net zero involving materials and energy and partnerships across the value chain with steel, cement, other building material organizations that could lead to more, I would say, an industry-wide approach to achieve reductions in the carbon footprint. So to summarize, what I would say is that embodied carbon will play an important role in the future as the stock increases. And with improved accounting, we would see better partnerships and more innovations in the sector that would lead to carbon reduction. Thank you. That's all from my end. Over to you, Trey.
Thank you very much for that, Anand. Again, very, very insightful and very interesting to see where India is heading in this regard. So last but not least, we have Miss Risha Arora from eCube. So Risha, over to you.
Thank you, Trey, and compliments to GRESB for organizing this webinar, because we've touched upon during the course of this session how real estate and infrastructure is accounting for a significant part of the GHG emissions globally. And while it may be somewhat lesser in India, it's still significantly higher than the two sectors' share of GDP. So real estate and infrastructure, approximately 17 to 18% of India's GDP, but the GHG emissions, and Anand just mentioned the figure, is close to 20-25%. Not to the level of UK, which Victor spoke about, but still disproportionately higher. So reducing the carbon footprint in the sector is a priority because of the significant impact it will have on India's climate action and the wider sustainability plans at the country level. But climate change is only one aspect of ESG. In fact, only one aspect of the E factor, the environment factor of ESG. I think equally important is social inequity and governance issues, which there are rising concerns on among various stakeholders. And these would be relevant to the real estate and infrastructure sector too. So when we talk about sustainability and ESG in India, There are about 3-4 dynamics at play here, which I'd like to talk about. I think firstly is the environment itself. I don't mean the environment as in the E of the ESG, but governments across the world are in a lot of ways leading the way with mandates and policies, giving direction and impetus to sustainability. And India is no exception. India's commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and climate change remains strong. The Indian PM announced the deepening commitment to climate at the Glasgow COP26 summit last year. And many of you may know that Niti Aayog has been tasked with tracking India's SDG performance. So at a country level, there's a lot of seriousness, and there's a lot of intent, and there's a lot of action to support that. Among other things, there are aggressive plans for green energy, clean mobility with the kind of incentives which are being given for manufacturing support to electric vehicles, and very, very ambitious targets for a share of electric vehicles in the entire mobility space by 2025. So a lot of enabling environment and a lot of government support to this initiative of sustainability is certainly building up. I think secondly, there's been a lot of dialogue and discussion on ESG in the recent past, and it is true that in some ways the journey in earnest has only just begun in India, and we may be at a point of inflection in terms of companies adopting the best practices and moving the needle on their ESG performance. But the efforts on institutionalizing ESG have been going on for almost a decade. In 2011, in fact, the National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Environment, and Economic Responsibilities of Business were issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. These were then revised and updated to what we have today in the form of NGRBC, the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct, which came into effect in 2018. I'm sure many of you would know about the BRSR, the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report template, which was formulated by the MCA again in 2020. And declarations and disclosures on this are voluntary for the current financial year and will be mandatory from FY23, which is next year, for the top 1,000 listed companies in India. So regulatory push is certainly one of the factors which is driving ESG in India. And you have various institutions and government bodies with a lot of plans and support on that front. SEBI has also introduced the stewardship codes for insurance company, mutual funds, pension funds. And there have been regulations on environment pollution, on board composition, minority shareholder protection, and a lot more. So the wider dynamics of sustainability is very significantly at play in India for some time, laying the ground for a lot of the action which we see happening today. I think in addition to the government support and regulatory push in India, and Sangeeta touched upon it in her session too, is the ESG as a driver for investors globally. And we know this is happening a lot more in the developed world, especially Europe, where investors have started engaging very deeply with companies on ESG related matters. So it's not a passive approach, it's a very active engagement approach. And for long-term institutional investors, ESG is becoming central to decision making. So if they are investing in India, they are certainly looking at it through an ESG lens. And in India too, this type of involvement is expected to grow in the coming years. Just a massive figure globally on the quantum of ESG assets under management. It's been growing exponentially. It's at about 36 trillion today, and expected to reach $53 trillion by 2025. In India, the comparable figure would be really minuscule, but it has nonetheless grown by 76% in FY21 versus FY20. So a lot of A lot of, I would say, enabling environment. There's a regulatory push. There is an investor push, and another factor which somehow is not very center stage right now is the consumer at the end of it. This generation of millennials and Gen Z is more alive to the need for sustainable living and consumption than any generation before. And there's lots of research and data which kind of shows that in very many different ways. And for an increasing number of this cohort, sustainability is a lens through which they make purchase decisions and also how they view organizations and institutions. So what does all this mean for the wider industry? And that includes real estate and infrastructure. How should organizations approach ESG? I think two aspects are critical here. One, that ESG is an ongoing process and not a one-time effort or event. When people first and organizations first get into ESG, they're looking at only a BRSR and the disclosures they're going to make there. But it's not a one-time thing. What this means is that efforts on this front have to be integrated into the core business and not something which sit outside of business with a sustainability team in an organization. Efforts on the non-financial ESG metrics have to be enmeshed and tracked along with the financial metrics to assess progress as a whole for the business. The second aspect is that before you even start tracking, you have to have an ESG strategy and plan. And where to start may seem like a daunting task because there's so much to do. And what Trey spoke about, and what Victor spoke about, and what Anand touched upon, that there's the key part of, in the real estate sector, the embodied carbon is not even being not really being focused on currently. And the approach should be to not get overwhelmed because there is so much to do, and there is a lot to do in every sector, and so it is with real estate and infrastructure. The ESG agenda cannot be addressed overnight. It is a way of doing business. And all of you who are in business would know that you build the business, one brick at a time. And sometimes you lay the bricks faster, but it's still one brick at a time. The question which often comes up in all this is, so what does ESG sustainability have to do with business? Again, a theme which was touched upon earlier during this webinar. ESG is an evolving field, but there is a lot of empirical data which is now coming to bear. Unfortunately, not so much in India, but there is a lot of empirical data globally which gives evidence of ESG risks affecting stock prices and both the top line and bottom line performance of corporates. For those of you who are familiar with the MSCI Markets Index, which is used to measure the financial performance of companies in economies around the world, and they run hundreds of metrics, there is an MSCI ESG Index, which kind of puts the ESG lens, and companies with higher ESG ratings have a weight in that index. And if you look at the normal MSCI index versus the ESG index, whichever time period you look at, whether it's 3-year returns, 5-year returns, 7, 10, or from inception, ESG leaders have kind of outperformed the overall benchmark indices by about 30 to 35%. So ESG makes business sense, and hard numbers are underscoring this aspect. Last, I want to touch upon two softer aspects of ESG, which are very critical to determining success. And they are collaboration and communication. Now, there was, Victor spoke about the whole LCA, the life cycle assessment of the asset. For organizations to find solutions for material aspects of ESG, it requires you to work in partnership with all the upstream and downstream partners to your core business. And this is not just true for real estate. In most industries, whether you look at the automobile industry, whether you look at the food industry, that is how ESG is going to get integrated into the core. It's only when you're looking at the entire life cycle, when you're working with partners upstream and downstream, that you'll together be able to address that problem. So in the real estate business, you have to collaborate with the steel and cement manufacturers. Concrete accounts for 70% of the total cost, designers, architects, and those who operate the asset subsequently, because when you build the asset, how you build it is going to have an impact on the operational carbon. The second soft aspect which I mentioned, which is communication. This is more for the internal organization, where there is a need to have that dialogue on ESG issues which are material. There's a need to discuss the challenges and the roadblocks which are there in its implementation. And there will be roadblocks. Anything which is, you know, almost like a new concept, and ESG is still in its nascent stage in India, it will require a lot of discussion and communication. And sensitizing internal stakeholders is as important as external stakeholders. So to wrap up, I would just say that ultimately it's about starting the journey, having the intent, and the rest will follow and fall in place in a lot of ways. The environment is right, the support is there, and it's really up to organizations and institutions to take this, this forward. Thank you for listening, and over to you, Trey.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Richa. Very informative as well. That just about does it for all of our speakers today. We do have a few questions, and we still have around 8 minutes or so left in this webinar. So what we'll do is we'll open the questions to some of our speakers. So I do see one from Rasvita Mudapalli. And the question that Rasvita has asked is operational carbon a subset of embodied carbon? So Victor, I think this is a good question for you if you have any insight.
Yes, thank you, Trey. That's a good question because it's good to differentiate that these carbon emissions are put in different buckets. So embodied carbon is not a subset of your operational carbon. Your operational carbon just looks at your operational energy use, so the use stage of your building. When embodied carbon is as emissions associated to your whole value chain, so upstream emissions, downstream emissions. In short, embodied carbon is every emission that is not related to operational energy. So now embodied carbon and operational carbon, and it's not a subset of one another.
Great, thank you for that, Victor. And there's actually another question that was put into the chat box. So I would like to remind everybody, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A button below instead of the chat box. But I will direct this over to you, Victor. It says, along with setting targets, how important do you think is incentivizing decarbonization projects with lower interest rates?
Yeah, when it comes to the low interest rate, I don't have that much exposure to that. With GRESB, we don't deal that much with the financial part, but the non-financial metrics. But it is key for decarbonization to happen, because it's also important to flag that embodied carbon is your upstream of downstream emissions, but they are actually direct emissions from some other sectors. So imagine if you're talking about a manufacturer from a product. If the grid is more decarbonized, then the energy used to produce this product will be coming from renewable energy, which are emission-free. So in consequence, your embodied carbon will also be lower, because this embodied energy used is lower. So it is very important to decarbonize, and for that, yes, some new project has to be there and incentivized by every front, right? If it's low interest, if it's regulation, if it's your investors' pressure.
Great, thank you, Victor. And there's actually another one in the chat box. So this will be the last one I answer from the chat box. So all other ones, please direct to the Q&A button. But this one is for Richa. So Richa, thanks for your presentation. Which ESG performance metrics, in your views, are most relevant to the real estate sector in India?
Interesting question, because when you get into each sector and you look at typically the all the material factors, the one which kind of stands out all the time is GHG emissions, because of the whole narrative and the dialogue and commitments around net zero, and that is certainly a very important factor for real estate. But I think the one factor which kind of gets a bit lost in this is the human capital and the social aspects of it, because when you're kind of building an asset, there is a whole army of workforce a workforce which is there on site. There is an army which is there when you're maintaining an asset. And I think the health and safety of that workforce and the labor is something which is not something which comes top of mind. To me, that's a very, very important factor. More important than when we typically talk about S, everyone talks about diversity and inclusion. And it may seem strange coming from me saying that I think that's not necessarily always the most germane. So I would say human capital as reflected in the workforce at different points in the value chain is the second factor. Third, I would say, is the entire supply chain. You know, what I was saying earlier, that upstream, downstream partners and how you work with that supply chain to find solutions, because ESG is a space where you can't find a solution alone. So you have to you have to have that collaboration with the supply chain. So supply chain itself becomes a very, very important factor there. Yeah, I would say these three. And we talk about governance in ESG, and I don't mean governance as the governance of the company, but when an asset is being built, the governance of that asset, where you oversee labor, where you oversee whether things are going as per the plan as far as your targets for your designing for minimizing GHG is concerned. So I think the governance of the project itself is, I would say, the fourth factor. And of course, there are a whole lot of other factors, but to me, these are the four must-dos, and the rest are things which you have to do.
Great, thank you so much, Risha. So I'll go back to the Q&A box now. So we do have another question from Sahil Agarwal. So the question is, understood the point that embodied carbon is definitely important to account, but embodied carbon is hard to quantify due to limited methodologies and data. So what are the tools, methodologies, industry-wide efforts that are being developed to help companies to account for embodied carbon? In India, are there any embodied carbon related methodologies or efforts to quantify? So Victor, this might be a good one for you as well, but if any of our other panelists have a specific answer to the Indian part of this question, that would be great to hear afterwards as well. Victor?
Yeah, no, thanks, Trey. That's a very good question, and there are some methodologies and frameworks out there that help you with that. I can give a few names. For example, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development have published an article, the carbon system framework, the building carbon system framework, that talks about whole life cycle emissions and how to quantify those. But it's basically following the standard that defines the life cycle stages, because then you understand and you can pinpoint the carbon hotspots when it comes to embodied carbon, for example. You can also use this in conjunction with some environmental product declarations, which are basically the environmental footprint of the products, the materials you use in the construction that is supplier specific. So there are frameworks, there are calculators over there that with some limited data sets, you can estimate your embodied carbon. But the point is, embodied carbon should be looked in the first stage of the development, right? So if you are in the design and planning of your new asset, you are in contact with suppliers, with materials. So things that you can do is ask for those environmental footprints of those materials, have policies that require low embodied carbon materials. So with that, you are able to quantify the embodied carbon. There are some barriers. The industry is not mature enough for this data to be disseminated all across the globe. But yeah, we do have some frameworks out there, and there are some tools as well. But this is more global. If any of our other speakers have any director or any pointer for an India specific one, I'll leave the floor for them.
I just want to add that the methodologies don't change with respect to geography. So they will, whatever is standard methods used globally will apply to India as well.
Very, very good. Thank you, Victor and Anand. So we're just at the end of the presentation, but we do have two other questions. So I understand that some people might have to jump off. But let's try to, for those that can stay on just for another few minutes, we will wrap up with these two last questions that we have here. And then after that, we can call an end to this webinar. So the next question is from Krutika, and it is, what are the incentives / how to incentivize small scale real estate developers at the individual level to start considering embodied carbon and whole life cycle? Would any of our panelists have a good response to that?
I can attempt one. I think for small scale real estate developers, it is important that they start on some form of carbon accounting and not really try and chew the entire space at one go, because it can become overwhelming and they will not see value of doing a carbon accounting, incorporating the entire spectrum. So small scale real estate developers should look at getting into the carbon accounting space first, look at operational carbon, get comfortable with that, see some value deriving out of that, and then include embodied carbon, because it might, if they don't see value, then it's going to be difficult for this community to sustain it. So I would advise small scale real estate developers to take it step by step, get into carbon accounting first, start disclosing, do the operational carbon, and then get into embodied carbon.
Thank you, Anand. That sounds like sound advice. Okay, and for the last question that we'll have today, this is an infrastructure one. So glad to have an infrastructure one in here as well. And this is also catered to the Indian market. So this might be a good one for you as well, Anand. The question is from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, what are the material ESG of linear infrastructure project parentheses, highways for Envint, considering land acquisition and design is in NHAI purview?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. As far as material factors are concerned with respect to any project or sector, it really doesn't depend on who's doing the project or who is taking care of what component of that project. Yes, NHAI would be looking at land acquisition, but it really doesn't change the fact that a lot of the material issues for a linear infrastructure project will be around rehabilitation, resettlement, and the social aspects, some of which that Richa spoke about. Those will become important. So regardless of which entity is undertaking the project, the material issues around, say, a highway will revolve a lot around social issues. It'll revolve around clearances, say, are you clearing forest land? Are you going through wildlife? What kind of permissions are being taken? What is the complexity of afforestation being done? So these are some of the points that I can think about at this stage.
I'll just add here a little bit. So one area in a highway construction that would be relevant would also be around EHS, because it entails the entire construction process. So what are your safety processes and systems relating to your, not just your own employees, but also to your contract labor that is employed on the site, right from the actual road construction to your supply, let's say, of the first year supply chain as the aggregate providers or the bitumen plants. So all of them entail some element of risk. And there is another element which can also be around emissions, not just the GHG, but also around air pollutants. Because a lot of these processes entail, let's say, mining, if it is aggregates or when bitumen is produced. So how well do you capture those elements? Are you tracking that in the first place?
Great. Thank you, Manish and Anand. And actually, I did say that was going to be the last question, but I did see that there was one more in the Q&A box. So we will wrap things up with this last question. So this is from Charmaine. Should embodied carbon also ideally be broken down into their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions impact as well? Does a LCA typically address to that level of granularity? And I think this is a good one for you, Victor, if you want to take that. And please, if you don't mind, we can answer this quite quickly since we already have reached the the end of today's allocated time.
Thanks, Trey. And this one is a very good one. That was a question that was puzzling me for a while as well. But yeah, you can break down embodied carbon in scope 1, 2, and 3 if you feel like. Just take for an example, if you are a developer and you are constructing a building, but the fuel used by the vehicles in the construction site, you own the vehicles. This would be your scope 1 emissions. But if you look to embodied carbon, operational carbon breakdown only, because this is your upfront emissions related to construction processes, this is your embodied carbon emissions. So yeah, depending of how you're looking at it, if you're looking into like the GRESB protocol perspective, where they divide scope 3 emissions into 15 subcategories, some of them are embodied carbon as well. It depends of how you're looking at it and your approach. If you're looking at a life cycle like approach, defining between operational and embodied carbon, or if you like, or if you're looking at it in the GRESB protocol approach, which is scope 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, you can break it down, but typically LCA is more towards embodied carbon and operational carbon division.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you, Victor. All right. Well, that will just about wrap things up for today. So thank you all again to everybody who's attended today's webinar. I personally found it very informative. It's always great to attend these just to learn about all the great developments going on in ESG, but also to be aware of some of the different things that we all need to be aware of to do our part within the ESG movement. So again, a special thanks to Envint and APREA, our partners, for helping us put on this webinar. And also a special thanks to all of our speakers today. So Sunita, Victor, Anand, and Risha, thank you again. All of your insight has been much appreciated. All right, everybody have a good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're based in the world. Until then, take care.